much. I want to bring in my guests. We are joined with the man of the hour, Koffi Kouakou. He is an African analyst, senior research fellow at the Center for African China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Welcome to the show, my man. How you doing today? You doing all right?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Jamal. And I'm glad you're doing well as well in this
Oh
beginning
man,
of this nice year.
yeah. So far, so good. I was telling the audience my Twitter account has been stolen, and so that
Really?
is super awkward. Because
Goodness.
it's like for one, you forget how much you use that stuff or those applications. Then you start thinking to yourself, okay, is my app being sexually abused in some way that is going to be screwed over when I finally get my hands back on the application?
No, it's
Hope,
it's it's a reputation. I have this famous quote when I was taking a security course way back in the US, and it was visibility leads to vulnerability.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess it does. Hopefully, they're not going to be any penis pics sent from that account, but that they're going to be blaming me for. They're going to be like, "We knew he was doing it. We knew he was doing it." It's like, dude, that's not me. That's not me. So hopefully nothing crazy happens. But yeah, it freaks
We
me out.
don't we don't want to lose you.
Right, right. Kofi, I wanted to bring you on. You sent me Trump 2.0, yeah, the 2.0 presidency. And one of the
Mm.
things you pointed out was the pulling away from the Paris Agreement.
Mm.
Well, that was one of the things. He pulled out of the World Health Organization. He pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Obviously, Trump's thing has been drill, baby, drill. What is the point of us not drilling more for oil? What is the significance of this? Or is there significance? Because the Paris Agreement wasn't ironclad. It was effectively just an agreement. It was consensus. It wasn't something where there was like a carrot and a stick approach. There wasn't any kind of there was nobody to wrap your knuckles if you didn't meet your requirements under the agreement. So what is, from your point of view, what is the significance of Trump pulling out of this agreement?
This is huge. And the reason why it's huge is that I know the way you've just commented on the Paris Agreement, that they didn't wrap people under the knuckles, but they were doing it. The global environmental climate cult elites have made this such a difficult thing for many countries, especially poor countries or what's called developing countries, countries that really don't have much power. They've been forced into agreements, and most of them don't read sometimes the fine print. However, I must say, the ideal behind it, the Paris Agreement, is a good one, but it seems to have been hijacked by commercial purposes and people using it to loan money. And the World Bank is now involved with the IMF, the International Monetary Funds. They're sort of having their goons out to forcing and wrapping people's knuckle to borrow money to deal with what's called climate transition, just transition and all other things that deal with climate. And now most Africans are finding themselves indebted because they've been borrowing money, and instead of borrowing money in currency where the interest rate is low enough, they're borrowing in US dollars or pounds, and then the interest rates keep accumulating and they're now in trouble. And
Interesting.
so, what makes it important for Trump, and the reason I think Trump 2.0 and the executive order that takes the US and withdraws it out of the Paris Agreement is so important, is that it shatters some kind of mindsets around all these climate issues, net zero. They've converted this thing again into a network, a cultish group of people. Very few people can really debate them. They've all
Mhm.
agreed. This is going to be, the IPCC, the UN group that came up with a 1.5 degree centigrade heat. If the climate goes up, there will
Yeah,
be a catastrophe. So how do you prepare for that? And it reminds me of, you remember the old days when we had this Y2K 2000?
yes.
Everybody was in all panic and something was going to happen. And strangely enough, nothing happened. And the funny thing is, most of these guys who created this whole fear mongering and so forth, they had a very good response to it. They said, well, we warned you, and I think human beings were prepared. That's why it didn't happen. You see, there's a very
It's
perfect
not that we got it wrong. It's just that
exactly,
we prepared you for it.
exactly. And I think the same is probably coming around this whole climate issue. And people are feeling uncomfortable, especially countries like South Africa and other sort of global South countries that are sitting on huge carbon-based, wealth, natural wealth assets, who want to use them. And they're now being told, no, 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 you've signed the Paris Agreement. You can't do that because if you did it, you're going to breach the agreement and you need to find a way, a strategy to do a just transition from coal to alternative or to green energies. But wait a minute, you don't have money for that though. We're going to loan you money. You see the scam?
Yeah.
And it's a very, very smooth scam that people would debate me about this and say, well, looks like I'm joining the loonies or something. But it is really reasonably good to question that. If I
Well,
have
see,
resources that I want to use, why can't I use that? But they've already signed the Paris Agreement. But to really close on to your question, why the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement by President Trump is so important is that what it does is it throws a monkey wrench into this whole sort of climate cultish group of people. They're now going to have to figure out because the simple fact that the US just withdrew sends a skeptical signal, and that skepticism will grow with time. And with time, the Paris Agreement, it won't be obsolete per se right now, but it might be dying very, very slowly. And
mhm.
that is a huge issue because there are thousands of programs that are around this whole climate change, from European aid to Africa, agriculture, this, and everything is around climate change. You can't do anything today without climate change.
I think there are two things that are going on simultaneously. I think, in one sense, more industrialized nations have been able to advantage themselves off of their energy resources. So it's like the US, Saudi Arabia, add in whatever other country, they've been able to say, we are going to maximize the usage of our energy resources in order for this kind of economic boon and economic benefit. And then they turn around to the rest of the world and say, hey, I know we did this, but we need you to not do this. So we need you to not advantage yourselves off of your own energy resources because, the climate is an issue now. And so we need you to come up with other ways for you to deal with your energy needs and for your own economic output. And you can imagine that any other country around the world looks at that and says, what the hell? How are you telling us that we can't benefit ourselves off of our energy resources in the same way that you guys were benefiting yourself off of those resources? And then you get other
Hmm.
countries, like smaller countries, that especially those countries that are in line for this kind of increased global instability from issues of climate, where those countries are like, okay, well, we didn't have anything to do with this, and yet we're paying the cost for it. Like we're getting hit with these heavier storms and heavier hurricanes and everything else as a result of you all exploiting your energy resources that were on your own continents. And so I totally understand where countries coming from, let's say like a South Africa or somewhere else, is like, okay, well, how is this fair? How on earth are you trying to put us in a straitjacket of climate legislation when you didn't have that straitjacket of climate legislation when you were exploiting your own resources? That is a fair point. I think the problem, though, is that the climate scientists may be right. Like we could see it getting hotter. We could see this kind of instability in the climate. We could see the nutrient content, for example, of foods going down because of the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. Like those things are clear and present, even in our lifespan. I'll give you an example. Virginia used to snow nearly every year. Every year, it used to be a snowstorm when I was a kid. Not so much anymore. And I even remember when I was in Poland at one point, and I think it was like negative 10 degrees below zero or something like that. And the guy pointed out, he says, yeah, it used to be much colder in the old days. So like we are seeing with our own eyes this kind of shift and change in climate, even within our own lifetime. So something is going on. I guess the question is, to your point, how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with that in a way that's fair to nations that never got the opportunity to exploit their oil resources because it comes a bit rich when you go to them and say, hey, I need you to remain in poverty and not exploit those oil resources because now we're dealing with an environmental catastrophe on a global scale. Is there any way to balance that equation?
One thing is we've been convinced already by the evidence is very overwhelming, as you're saying, from the IPCC, UN IPCC, and other groups and so forth. Daily the evidence is, according to them, is coming to our eyes that it's more of a what's called the Anthropocene, which means human beings are the major causes of this,
Right.
rather than
right.
rather than a regular, if you want, climate cycle event. And so they're dismissing the climate cycle event right away, out of hand, because they think their data is what we need to trust. But people say, no, bring the regular climate cycle as well. But most important, one way to probably balance that is to use technologies. Technologies can change the way, all these coal-based, if you're on energy sources that are being produced, can be transformed for what many people are now talking about, just transition, not just transitioning for transitioning, but it must help everybody, And so China is already doing that. Why aren't we doing that? Right? And which means the money, the resources to be borrowed will go to efficient technology that can transform at least what we have so far, the coal, into some kind of acceptable energy base. Or we can have a mix, maintain a bit this sort of coal base, and then work very hard on finding new technologies that will move us. China is working on incredible technologies. I don't want to be giving names to your strange names to your audience, but China is just doing extraordinary stuff. It's unbelievable the kind of things they're doing, and they're looking at free type of energy. They're going to be distributing. They're working that in the Gobi Desert. I'll send you a couple of things about it. You'll be able to see. But
by the way,
is there.
Just to boost your point for a moment, I'm sorry to interrupt. One of the things that they were planning on doing is putting these things in space, these panels in space that will beam energy back to the globe. Just astonishing. Like science fiction has talked about this stuff for a while, and China's decided, by the way, we're going to do that.
Yeah, China is a technology society, a civilization now. It's hard for them to get back, and they understood that if you can master technology, as they say themselves. One of their leaders, I think it was either Deng Xiaoping or Zhou Enlai, you can bypass the problems of underdevelopment. And they are now doing it. They're using it anywhere. Look at the shocking announcement this past week, about that new AI technology, DeepSeek R1 platform. Everybody's shocked to say, how did these wizards do that? And under a very small amount of money, 5.5 million US dollars instead of 10, 15 billion. And, OpenAI with Sam Altman and the other people, Microsoft, everybody's now in panic. So technology can help us balance it, and even cheaper. And the problem with the West is that they've made all these technologies so expensive and unaffordable so that it makes it difficult for quote unquote poor countries or developing countries to find solutions to the just transitions. And I think to answer your question, we can look at this place, at a little bit of mix, but if we can find the technologies, help ask countries like China, we're really ready to do it to help. I think we can really find a great solution for the future.
No, that's a really good point. Keep in mind from the West, look, we treat our own citizens the exact same way. If a kid wants to go to school, we're going to be like, hey, it's going to cost $50,000 if you want to get a degree so you have somewhat of a decent life. So when we're looking out at the rest of the world, we think the same way. And by the way, we treat Europe the same way. When the Ukraine war took place, for example, and Joe Biden pushed Europe to try to sever its energy ties with Russia, basically to pass sanctions and everything else, the US was charging Europe 5 times more than what they were paying for energy from Russia. And I remember, I think it was Macron went to Joe Biden one day and was like, "Hey, Joe, aren't we in this together? Like, how are you charging us this much money for energy when we're passing sanctions in lieu of, the U.S.'s pressure on us?" And Joe Biden was like, "We're not in this together. What are you talking about? Pay us, give us the money for it." So you can imagine that if they're even talking to Europe that way, then of course they're going to look at the rest of the world and say, "We have a financial advantage. Pay us." Now, of course,
Mm,
the problem with this is you have other countries now that are not, this is not the Second World War where everywhere is destroyed. You have
mm,
China, you have BRICS nations, you have this alternate economy that is springing up where the US is going to have to compete with going forward. And so there's that. I'm curious on BRICS. Where does BRICS play into the climate change issue? Like, I know BRICS is somewhat of a new organization in regards to them getting their legs under them. But have they made any, let's say, dictates around the issue of climate change and the issue of climate policy? Have they touched that at all as an organization?
huge. But before I get to that, I want to agree with you on this whole thing between Macron and Biden.
Mhm.
And one of the things that AOC said it's about the Benjamin, my friend.
Yes, it is. Hey,
And
yes.
then power. That's right. So with the BRICS are taking this whole climate issue also seriously, but they're not extreme as most of the people in the West. They're a little bit more rational about it. So climate multilateralism is a key issue, how to manage it as a global commons rather than having an isolated group. So they're
Mhm.
helping people. And at the heart of this whole climate multilateralism is the idea of energy sovereignty. All of them agree with this, especially Russia and China. They know if you don't have energy sovereignty, you just are not going to be able to make it. You won't even have power, literally, in the sense of feeding your own energy, your own companies, your own industries, and so forth, as well as having global power, naturally, soft power, hard power. And so they're taking it very seriously. I think at the in Kazan, I can't remember to read it to you directly or verbatim, but they issued some point on it, and they're very serious. Remember, most of these BRICS countries are energy resource, crude natural resources powerful. Even when
Mhm.
Kazan, where it took place, the country is a powerful oil producer, oil and gas producer, and they're also very serious on other sources of energy. So that's the key. So they're all working on ways and means to exercise that energy sovereignty. And I think it links also to multilateral, multipolar world and so forth, because they realize that if they don't have that energy power or energy sovereignty, there's no way they can compete against the West or the United States.
It's a really good point. I mean, if you think, because what, it's the UAE, you have UAE, Saudi Arabia. I guess Saudi Arabia is kind of like a partner.
Yeah.
Iran, Russia, all of these are major oil producers. Like they've like hemmed up the major oil producers around the world. So no, that's a really good point. Um,
Indonesia.
yeah, Indonesia is the new one that's apparently joining.
Yeah.
A huge nation, another one that's
Huge.
coming to the fold. You mentioned we were you and I were having this conversation the last time you were here about France leaving all of these parts of Africa, and I believe Chad was the last nation for France to leave. How many other nations did France? Well, let me ask you this first. Chad was not part of the Sahel states that initially had the
Yes, yes.
overthrow.
Chad was. Remember, Chad was, and Chad. They had some kind of coalition against terrorism called the G5.
I
So
see.
there were five Sahelian countries. Chad, Niger, Mali,
So,
Mauritania, and Burkina Faso.
okay, and
Mm,
so at this point, France has been evicted out of all of those. Correct.
mm. Yes, France has been evacuated out of. Well, Mauritania. It's not quite. Mauritania has left ECOWAS a long time ago, but
Mhm.
France is out of Mali. France is out of Burkina Faso. France is out of Niger. France is out of Chad. But also, France is going to be out of Senegal, which is not quite. Well, Senegal is partly a Sahelian country, but is not ruled by a military government.
I
So
see.
this way. Remember when you and I have been talking about this for 2 years, and I said, please, Jamal, watch this wave coming out of Mali. And very slowly it's been building up where people are saying, we don't want the French. We don't want the French. We want to deal with our own problems on our own, and we'll deal with other people who need to help us. So it started in Mali with President Assimi Goïta, and then he moved to Burkina Faso
Mhm.
with the young military groups. Then Ibrahim Traore, who is now getting an enormous amount of reputation across the West Africa, in fact, across Africa, wherever he goes, he's just being sort of, I mean, the people are just stepping over each other to just greet him. He was in Ghana for the new president, and he was there with his gun. And of course, you know how the media portrayed him as a military ruler who had no consideration for security and so forth. But people loved him there. And then moving to Chad, Niger, with General Tiani, and
Mhm.
now in Chad with Itno. And what's happening is that all these countries are now realizing that it seems the moment the timing is right, there's some kind of very critical tipping point that is forcing them to say we don't want any French troops in our environment. However, the French are regrouping and reorganizing themselves to move down south, especially in Benin, Togo, Gabon, and then of course Cote d'Ivoire. And in Cote d'Ivoire, as we discussed, you and I, the U.S. is already building, has cut a deal, defense and security deal with the government of Cote d'Ivoire to establish a couple of military bases in the northwestern part of the country, in a place called Odiene, a place that I know quite well. But they're also trying to maintain the U.S. and then NATO are trying to maintain a strong presence down south, especially for the control of the Gulf of Guinea. When we get a chance, we can talk about this. I was privy enough to have some work. We'll talk about the details later, but it is a very strategic region that the US and then NATO wants to control because
Mhm.
of the marine wealth and then also the geostrategic location of that place for global power.
France has said that Africa seems to not appreciate the benefit that France was given to Africa. Are you, according to Macron, they seem to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Not unsatisfied. They didn't thank France.
They're not grateful.
Right, that's the word. That's right.
Yeah,
Macron said that you are ungrateful, Kofi, for
yeah.
all of the benefit that France has given Africa over all of these years of colonialization and everything else. Are you ungrateful, Kofi? Is that what's going on?
I think President Macron, I'm sorry to say that he's taking a beating for it from Senegal, the new president, Diomaye Faye, and then his Prime Minister Sonko, where his case, reminding him that if it were not for African soldiers who were grateful to go and help the French, French will be speaking German today. You know, and then of course, the president of Chad, where the French are supposed to leave military base is supposed to disappear out of there. They had three of them. They had one in the northern parts, Fire Largo, and then one in the middle, and then they have one in Jamena. They're leaving
Mhm.
by the end of the 31st of January. But President Itno has said he was not happy, and he said to President Macron, please, your reorganization is your organization, but don't think that we did it because you asked us to reorganize. We decided to really cut the relationship, military relationship with you because we think we can really now secure our own borders. We'll
Mhm.
do business with you, but on our own terms. And the French are really livid, especially President Macron, who, in fact, his popularity rate is very, very low in the 20s
Yeah.
in France, which is terrible. He's in trouble across the board. Things are not working well for him in France. We're not quite sure. He doesn't want to resign either. So he's taking a beating both abroad, especially in West Africa, in the Sahel, and also at home with his own people.
Yeah, he is. He really is. I like that is rich. But keep in mind, France is the same country that forced Haiti to pay it back for slaves. Like, think about that. Like the notion that you invade a country, you colonize the country, you make slaves out of the population, and then when the country rebels, you say, okay, but now you need to pay us the value for your labor. Basically, you need to pay us for the fact that you were now slaves. Like this is a country that we're talking about here. So it's not necessarily shocking that Macron will say something like that. You also pointed out that Russian troops have been getting far more involved in the military situation in Africa, specifically in this case Mali. What is
Yes.
going on with that? Like, what is? I haven't heard much in regards to Russia ingratiating itself more into Africa. At the very least, I haven't heard about it for a few months. The war, and then Israel has been taking priority in regards to the news cycle. What is going on in regards to Russia ingratiating itself into these African states?
They've been doing strategically quietly enough. And in fact, what we're hearing is that the sort of leftover of the Russian military, hardware and software in Syria,
Hmm.
part of that is moving into Mali, which to a certain degree, it's really a strengthening relationship between Mali and Russia. Is also leverages Mali's FAMA, the defense force, and gives them some arms to defend against the terrorists in the northern part. But it's also going to be a concern for the West and for NATO, because as Russia moves in, Russia is now starting to establish itself in that region. And the potential for confrontation is likely between NATO, the West, the United States, and then Russia in that region. Of course, they'll be watching each other like chickens for a while, but something's probably going to give in that region. And Russia is meticulously building its reputation and influence in that region like never before. It's starting with Mali. As you know, Russia is already building, I think, two uh, civilian nuclear um, units
Stations. Yeah.
in yes, stationed in Burkina Faso, and that's going to keep growing. And Russia has already signed about 20 military partnership deals well, of course, with 20 African countries. That's big.
Wow.
And Russia's presence is growing really, really, really big. And in fact, geopolitically, it is that force that also giving a bit of spine to African countries to resist France. And that have been something that most people don't talk much about it. They make it sort of an afterthought, but it's not quite that. The Russians play a role in supporting what now Africans are calling decolonization or 2.0 has been tremendous. It's something to really look into and understand. And that's giving strength to most African countries to now say, France, we can deal with our own.
That is that is super interesting. Decolonization 2.0.
You know,
Oh, that's fascinating. Because it goes with this idea that it I guess fits and starts. It's like, yeah, we decolonized the first time around, but France still had this latent influence in our politics and in our geopolitics in a way that wasn't necessarily to our best interests. Whereas now this is being severed in its entirety. Well, and you made the point of saying this is going to sweep all across Africa at this point, that this mindset, this revolutionary mindset, is going to effectively flow all across the African continent. Do you still see it that way?
yes, I strongly see it that way. However, there's been a strong pushback, very slowly and smart, from the people who don't want to see that happen, especially against Mali, Burkina Faso, where you have had already more than 9 to 10 military coups in each of these countries. Even in Chad, last month, there was another coup attempt that was foiled, with many people dead. People want them dead because if that continues, as I said, the wave's going to take the whole continent. And when the whole African continent is free or can stand by itself, it will be a disaster, especially for former colonizers or Europe or European countries and the United States, because most of them are taking largely the resources from the continent for pittance, almost for free. I mean, you see what's happening in the DRC now,
Mhm.
where there have been some chaos there, where the M23 rebel group has been taking over territories, and they do that because of the wealth that they're extracting there with the support of Rwanda. I mean, there are plenty of UN security reports accusing Rwanda of supporting those rebel groups that are extracting the wealth and that Rwanda is benefiting from, especially coltan, tantalum, and all these things that are being used for technological products and that are being used by Apple and all other companies. It's a huge battle down there, and African resources are at the heart of it.
But this battle is not being fought among African states per se. This is, or is
By
it?
proxy. By
Yeah,
proxy.
that's what I say by proxy.
Yeah.
So the belief is that Rwanda is fighting on behalf of another, let's say, a European actor. Is that the thought?
Yes, of course. And not only European actors, but also the US or US
Yeah.
companies. And it's quite very well known. And but Rwanda has been denying it. In fact, this week, President Paul Kagame has been on, French television and French media saying if the DRC wants to fight, they'll fight, which is a very dangerous approach because as soon as breaks up, this is not going to be another chaotic environment and situation in Central Africa. And we don't want these kind of fights. We also don't want the continuous exploitation of these resources when you
Mhm.
have, sovereign country that should decide that.
No, that's a good point. And I guess that's why it's so relevant and significant that this kind of decolonization 2.0 takes place. What's always fascinated me is that Africa is a very rich country. And for all of the people who say, well, it's a poor country, well, no, it's not a poor, well, not country, continent. It's a it's a rich continent. If it wasn't a rich continent, you would have had all of these countries trying to colonize, these various countries.
Indeed.
Um, what does it look like? And I guess from my point of view, looking at this, do you think that this is going to be a situation where no, Africa will take control of its own natural resources and they will be able to kind of, I guess, rebuild itself in a way that it wasn't necessarily able to rebuild itself under colonialization? Is that the thought? And do you see that happening? I mean, because what it seems like is that there are two forces that are taking place in Africa, maybe more. One has to do with the local population themselves who want a better life, a better standard, etc. And you have these other recalcitrant groups that are working with, let's say, the Europeans or the Americans, let's just say the West, for their own advantage against the advantage of the populations themselves. Now, some of them may call this a democracy, fair enough. But basically, you have this kind of latent colonialism that is kind of still there, that Africa seems to be still working itself out of. How do you see it? I mean, am I getting this right in regards to my framing of what's taking place in Africa right now?
Of course you are. I think as much as there's so much pessimism, I mean, we pessimism and hopelessness have both become one of our commodities every time we talk about the African continent. I mean, most Africans, we're drowning in it. We can't. I mean, most people don't even see a light out of the tunnel in the future.
But this seems
There's some
hopeful, though.
something.
I mean, this seems
Indeed,
hopeful in a way that
there's
wasn't
some
there
hope.
prior.
That's what I'm saying. There's some hope, and that's one of the reason these three countries or four countries that are emerging, even though they're emerging out of military coup d'états, they are now ordering and giving a sense of direction to what it should be, what sovereignty should be, what people should be organized and disciplined to take the country out of the mess. I mean, those two countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, in less than 2 years that they've taken over, the military group have taken over, they've managed to pay off their debts to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It's never been seen before. Even the so-called democratically elected leaders haven't managed to do that. I mean, the country down south, Cote d'Ivoire, is in debt by, thousands of thousands. And it's just almost unbelievable to see that from these young military dudes, if I want to say that are now, they're marching on a different tune. They say, leave us alone. We need to organize ourselves. The IMF and the World Bank have been forcing down the throat some loans to Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traore said, no, we don't want your loans. Leave us alone. We'll manage with what we have. We'll do it slowly, but we'll manage. And I think this is a hope. If that hope continues to grow and to become stronger, and if they're not killed, because the coup d'etats, already 10 in Burkina Faso, 9 in Mali, and then two I think in Chad. It's really concerning. And if those keep maintaining their position and they keep developing, and people can see the evidence, very quickly it will spread to the other countries. And I would say in the next 10 to 15 years, we can have a real serious hope to see African countries emerge, not fully, but at least also with the help of Russia and China. They'll be able to stand on themselves alone.
Kofi, that is indeed a hopeful message. In a way that wasn't there prior. Are there any plans, and this will be the last question, are there any plans for them to hand back over to civilian authority, or are they going to we're going to midwife this revolution and we're going to see it through? How are they looking at it on the ground?
I mean, they have some plans to do that. In Burkina Faso, it's the next 5 years. And I think in Mali, it was supposed to be last year, but they extended it until I think another 2 years. But it's a clever way to push those boundaries and then the sort of time horizons. Because if you hand this thing again to the same so-called elected African leaders, civilians, it will turn into another nightmare. And that's what most people don't want to see anymore.
Koffi Kouakou, man, I always appreciate these conversations. You're very illuminating on these issues. And yeah, I do believe this is a hopeful message in regards to what Africa could be, as you call it, decolonialization 2.0. Koffi Kouakou, he's an African analyst, senior research fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Koffi, man, you have a safe day. Be safe, man. Have a good one.
You're welcome. Thanks very much.
Thanks, man. Always appreciate those conversations. It's so rare that we get to have this kind of talk about what's taking place in Africa. So I always love Koffi for coming on and